Welcome to Newshour. President Donald Trump's decision to suspend all US aid to Ukraine has caused shock and concern in Kyiv and across Europe. This is not the first time that the US has withheld military aid to Ukraine. It did so back in 2023, but it could turn out to be the most significant. Let's go straight to Kate Fisher now in Washington, D.C.
Guy, this is the clearest signal yet to show just how far the relationship between Kyiv and Washington has deteriorated since Donald Trump took office. In recent weeks, he has been echoing the talking points of Russia's Vladimir Putin. He has accused Ukraine of starting this war when, of course, it was Russia who invaded Ukraine. And he's called Ukraine's leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, a dictator. But this decision, this order to pause military aid to Ukraine will have the biggest effect on this conflict so far, really strengthening the hand of Vladimir Putin and making it so much harder for the Ukrainians to defend themselves. The White House has said it will stay in place, this pause in aid, until they see a good faith commitment from Ukraine that they will come to the negotiating table with Russia to seek an end to this war. But it's not clear what the details of that would be, what it would actually look like, and how long this pause could last. So analysts think that Ukraine probably has enough weapons to last them until maybe the beginning of the summer to be able to fight at this level. But after that, it's going to be up to Kyiv and Europe to keep those guns firing in Ukraine. Kate Fisher for A News in Washington.
OK, let's stay in Washington, D.C. now and speak to A News' Ube Shah-Banda. Ube, always great to hear from you. Thank you, as always, for joining us. Right, let's dig into this now. It's not the first time that the US has held aid back from Ukraine. Supporters of President Trump are arguing that there have been concerning ambiguities about the way funds have been used. Is it reasonable to pause then in order to properly evaluate precisely where taxpayers' dollars are going? Or is it just more Machiavellianism from the US president? What's your perspective?
Well, what the Trump administration is saying is that they want to see a real commitment by Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky towards accepting the Trump negotiated peace talks and ceasefire talks with the Russians. So behind closed doors here, the Trump administration is saying that they, following that disastrous meeting last week with Zelensky, they want to see real movement by Zelensky towards not only the U.S. negotiated process, but also towards sort of accepting the Trump view that this war must come to an end. So certainly the impact of that Oval Office meeting, which last week, which started off amicably enough, but ended up with Zelensky being essentially told to leave the White House and with a planned minerals rights agreement being shelved indefinitely. So that meeting is reverberating towards that decision that was made by the Trump administration to put an immediate pause by the order of the president on all of that military aid going to Zelensky. So there's the political component here is clear, is that that the White House does not believe that there has been sufficient commitment by Zelensky towards the peace talks, that the Trump administration has been very clear. They want to see an accelerated timetable. They don't want Zelensky to delay a ceasefire, which would then serve as the first and important step towards a sustainable peace deal with Vladimir Putin. And you saw on social media on Monday, President Trump expressing outrage at a statement that was attributed by the media to President Zelensky. And Trump made it very clear on his Truth Social post that he's not seeing sufficient commitment by Zelensky towards the Trump plan to end this war, and that led to an emergency meeting in the White House and then this decision to halt military aid. Now, what will it mean from a practical perspective? Certainly, there is going to be an impact on the battlefield, particularly when it comes to Ukraine's air defense munitions and the missiles that the Ukrainians use in their Patriot air defense batteries, which are provided by the Americans. The reason for that is that the Ukrainians expend a significant amount of these missiles in defense of their critical infrastructure and air bases and weapon production plants, and of course protecting civilians. And that's because the Russian military launches these massive waves of kamikaze drones, followed by cruise missile attacks and ballistic missile attacks. And the Russians are spending at least 9% of their GDP on their military. So the production of those missiles and kamikaze drones, including procuring them from Iran and North Korea by the Russians, has enabled them to essentially outproduce the Ukrainians. And so the United States is providing, at the very least, 20% of the munitions that the Ukrainians are using on any given day on the battlefield. So the immediate halt of all this military aid is going to certainly have an impact on the battlefield. And on the political side, I think that is the intent here by this decision that has been made by the White House, is that they want to use that leverage and that pressure on Zelensky and the very real battlefield impact that this decision will have to force Zelensky back to the negotiating table and to the Trump brokered deal with the Russians. It's a ceasefire deal that is taking place in parallel with the ongoing normalization negotiations between Washington and Moscow. So in other words, Trump wants Zelensky to play ball.
Ube, this is a developing story where there's been a lot of emotion, a lot of passion on both sides of the argument. You're someone that gets to peek inside the Washington bubble. When you go away from the press statements and the cameras, you go to the bars, the restaurants of Washington where these private discussions take place. Is there any concern there that the president just keeps doubling down with these very blunt interventions?
Well, as Trump always says, the United States is protected by two massive oceans. I believe President Trump's own words are two beautiful oceans. And the reality is that beyond the analysts and the people that live within the confines of Washington, D.C., your average American is not really paying attention to foreign policy, particularly that is not impacting American troops or American interests, at least from the perspective of your average American, directly. So certainly the Democrats, the opposition, the political opposition in Washington, they're up in arms against, President Trump's decision to halt military aid. But we've seen the Republicans, essentially, even those like Senator Lindsey Graham, who've been very vocal proponents of arming Ukraine and supporting their war effort. We've seen Republicans across the board essentially back President Trump's decision, particularly following what happened last week with that Zelensky meeting in the Oval Office. And the message here by the president and his team is that they want to prevent World War III, which could then suck in American troops and impact the American public directly. And I think that is really helping President Trump sell his policy on Ukraine to the wider American public. Certainly, there's been outrage by the corporate media here in Washington and those that have historically supported Ukraine, but many, including some Democrats, have following that Zelensky meeting in the White House, actually expressed sympathy to President Trump's position, with a general view that Zelensky should have waited to express his concerns with President Trump behind closed doors. And of course, President Trump is going to be giving a speech to Congress where he's certainly going to expect opposition from the Democrats. But from your average American, even those that are sympathetic to Ukraine, there's also a great deal of sympathy from the messaging coming to the White House, which is, hey, we want to prevent World War III. We want to end the war and end the killing and end the slaughter. And that, I think, is really resonating. And look, this is not the first time that an American president, whether Republican or Democrat, has used American military aid as leverage to gain the desired political or diplomatic outcome. So there is obviously a great deal of precedent here. The question is that, how dire will the battlefield impact be in Ukraine? Of course, this is happening right as the Europeans, in response to President Trump's moves, have declared that they are launching a multi-billion-dollar Rearm Europe plan. And so that is also another important part of the messaging from President Trump and his senior advisors, is that, hey, we want the Europeans to do more, and only by being very tough in the American approach can we incentivize the Europeans to take more ownership and equity in defending their continent, particularly when at a time of the largest and deadliest European war since the Second World War, with at least 800,000 Russians, soldiers killed and wounded, and a similar amount by a much smaller population size Ukraine in terms of the battlefield casualties that it has faced in this 3-year-long war. So, certainly there was a great deal of outrage expressed by some corners to President Trump's announcement, but you also have to remember that this is a pause on military aid, not a total sort of pulling the plug on all support to Ukraine. And I think the White House's message here is that, look, Zelensky now is at a decision point, and he has to come back and essentially tell President Trump that you're right, and I'm going to accept your ceasefire deal with the Russians, and I'm going to, do whatever it takes to end this war. And that very well could be, the fact that, Zelensky may have no other option but to do so, because the European defense industry simply cannot make up for the massive amounts of American munitions, whether it's artillery shells and air defense missiles that the Ukrainians receive. And it's going to take some time for the European defense industry to make up for that massive gap in terms of the billions of military aid that the Americans provide the Ukrainians, and just how much the European defense industry, which has not, frankly, been fully mobilized in a wartime setting in terms of what they can provide to fill that gap now that U.S. military aid has essentially completely come to a halt.
Ube, what's your analysis of what President Trump really wants? Is it an apology from President Zelensky's resignation, an immediate agreement to the ceasefire deal, or is he more pragmatic? What's your sense of President Trump's wish list and his red lines?
I think it's clear at this point that President Trump wants President Zelensky to unconditionally accept the American ceasefire process, and to essentially say, without any conditions, that he will sit down and accept a ceasefire deal that is being negotiated directly by the Americans and by Moscow. And I think that's the only thing at this point that can get that the flow of American weapons, which, by the way, these are tranches of weapons that are essentially that were agreed upon from the previous administration. And so I think it's going to take a very clear, concise, and unambiguous statement by President Zelensky, if not at least a full-fledged apology to President Trump, to then have President Trump change and alter his course of action. And we've seen that message coming from Vice President J.D. Vance, who President Trump listens to and has been very vocal on Ukraine and American foreign policy on the Ukraine-Russia war. And behind closed doors, we've also seen, the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, actually not even behind closed doors, very publicly, telling the American press, hey, we have a ceasefire process here, and President Zelensky needs to get on board. So it's going to require perhaps President Zelensky to, in other words, eat some humble pie and come back and say, I will accept the ceasefire process. Yes, it may not be ideal, but we have no other choice. If and whether or not that would come with an apology or not, essentially it will require Zelensky to make a major policy course of action, that Washington wants to see. So clearly here, President Trump wants to see not only a change of tone by President Zelensky, but also he wants to see Kiev, all in on the Trump peace process without any conditions and, any additional talk of American security guarantees, particularly with now, European countries and the United Kingdom and France saying that they will provide the requisite security guarantees to Ukraine once a ceasefire deal is signed.
And just staying with Europe, Ube, it's very clear that President Trump is not a huge fan of the EU, but is very fond of individual European countries. After so much has occurred in recent weeks, what do you suspect might be a way forward for the bilateral relationship between the EU and the US? Is there any hope that after all of this discord and disagreement, that there could be a new way of the two entities working together?
Well, it was interesting to see the meeting, the emergency meeting that took place in London, with Keir Starmer and President Zelensky following that disastrous meeting in the Oval Office last week. And the message from London and from Paris is that, look, we will continue to support Ukraine, but we still need the United States, and the transatlantic partnership is still absolutely crucial. And we've heard that from both President Macron of France and from Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And frankly, it was interesting to see Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission's president, in a speech made earlier today saying that Europe needs to rearm itself and to do more in defense of the continent. And that is a direct result of President Trump's statements and policy positions. And, not that long ago at the Munich Security Conference, just a few weeks ago, J.D. Vance stood up on the podium and said that, hey, Europe needs to do exactly this, that they need to have a conversation with the European people and saying that we need to do more for our own country's defense. Look, the Russians produce, according to European analysts, more weapons in 3 months than the entirety of the major member states of the European Union do in 1 year. Russia spends 9% of their GDP on their armed forces. And, it's taking a great deal of pressure from Washington to get NATO member states to, spend at least 3% of their GDP on defense, although Poland is going to increase it upwards of 5%. So there is, and that has been the point of contention. Washington saying that, hey, we're the ones that are spending, an extraordinary amount of money, of taxpayer monies, and weapon stockpiles that are going directly from American warehouses all the way to Ukraine that will take, months, if not years, to to make up the stockpiles that are being expended and sent to the Ukrainians, which would leave the Americans vulnerable in case another contingency or another conflict, perhaps in the Pacific or elsewhere, takes place on short notice. So I think on one hand, the transatlantic, the pressure that the Trump administration is putting on the European Union seems to be, in other words, working. And the stark realities, given that the Russian armed forces have more brigades than Ukraine and most major militaries in Western Europe do combined. So that stark reality is not changing anytime soon. And I think there is a recognition in Paris and London and in Eastern Europe and Berlin that you still need American military might, and that we as the European Union need to do more to get our defense industry and militaries prepared for a major potential conflict down the line, and or at the very least, to make up for the loss of American military aid to Ukraine. Look, the reality is it's going to take months, if not perhaps years, for the European defense industry to be able to even come close to what the Americans are providing the Ukrainians. And look, the fact that this announcement that's being made just today by the European Commission is taking place 3 years into the war in Ukraine, which is a European war. So some may say that perhaps this is what it took a Trump presidency, Trump being reelected to the White House, to finally light that flame of urgency for Europe to really take more equity and more leadership when it comes to providing military aid to Ukraine and significantly expanding their own defense industry expenditures. So I think on one hand, the reaction from Berlin, London particularly, and Paris to the Trump announcement has been that, okay, this is unfortunate. We need to find a solution, but certainly there doesn't seem to be any talk in the European Union that the transatlantic relationship with the United States in any shape, way, or form is somehow null and void, particularly given the concern of a much more expanded and powerful, Russian military, and the very real fears that Ukraine, when it comes to the battlefield situation, is facing a Russian military that may not have the same type of qualitative type of military as in terms of what the West is providing in military equipment, but they have a massive quantity advantage.
Big advantage indeed. Very interesting indeed. Ube Sharbanda in Washington, D.C. for us there. Thank you very much, as always, for joining us. Well, that is all we have time for on this edition of NewsHour. Please do stay with us for more news and analysis. And from all of us here in Baku, thank you for watching.